This is Anish Chauhan and this is Equilibrium Security. It's time to tackle your biggest cyber security challenges head on. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 16 of our podcast, The Cyber Hot Seat. This time we are joined by Josh Fulford, part of the solutions team at Chaleit. Hi, Josh.
Good morning, Anish. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for being here. So just a quick intro for yourself, Josh. So you've been in the industry for about 7 or 8 years now. And at Chaleit, you're very much focused on customer solutions and building out the sales functionality. Now, although we are going to look at things from a sales perspective, the heading for today's episode is the cyber security sales trap. Are you actually investing in the right protection? Now, that heading is very kind of loaded in one regards. And so the first thing I'm going to open up with for you, Josh, is do you think that there are cybersecurity solutions that actually fail to address the problems that business face? Now, if you say no, then the podcast is going to be quite short. So it's a little bit of a loaded question. But yeah, just tell us a little bit about your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a topic area that really does need some coverage because all of us work for organizations and there's always going to be a element of bias. And we had this discussion not that long ago, Anish. And I think it's always difficult when someone asks you as a security organization what your thoughts are on another security organization, because there's always going to be an element of bias.
Yeah.
Now, I think where we've probably got ourselves into a bit of a sticky situation within the industry, I've certainly noticed this over the past kind of 5 years, is this element where you're absolutely right to ask that question. Are we always selling solutions that are fit for purpose? And I think what we've got now is a situation where there's highly funded vendors that are taking this one size fits all approach. And as we know in security, that's just never, ever going to be the case.
No.
And I think it's just a conversation which is probably quite strange for other people to hear. Other salespeople might feel a bit personally attacked by this, but it's not that at all. It's just actually looking after your customers in the best possible way and assuring that, again, you're having their best interests at heart. And that's not to say that I don't think people are. I just think that, again, as an industry, we need to be a bit more customer specific and a bit more customer centric as opposed to generic. Just seen it as an alarming trend.
Yeah, it is, and I think you touched on quite an important point there about I think you mentioned investment or security, a financial backing that's kind of drives a lot of it from the bottom line up really, and that's like, okay, cybersecurity is a very lucrative industry, so let's build this and let's create this, and we want this much IPO and want to float at this point, and it's all driven by that. So from you've obviously had if you from your kind of building out solutions for your clients perspective, you've had conversations with CISOs, you've had conversations with IT leaders. Do you see frustrations from their perspective? Like, obviously we're having this conversation because we've got like an overall view of the industry, haven't we? And we've got we've been in it long enough to see what's good and what's bad. And so do you see the heads of IT and decision makers and CISOs, etc., getting frustrated with the situation and go on?
Yeah, very much so. And I think we've almost built ourselves as a sales, cyber and sales now. We've almost got a bit of bad rep. There's almost a bit of a negative connotation association with us now because I've really sympathized with anyone buying any kind of cybersecurity solution or any kind of cybersecurity at all now, because not only is the market so dense, everyone says the same thing. Everyone says the same thing in a slightly different worded way. Yeah. And there's always this, we do this, and it's typically vendor led.
Yes.
What I think leaders and people in C-suite and people that we speak to get so frustrated at is the lack of adaptation to them specifically. So it's
right. Yeah.
It's that vendor to customer, not customer, let's have a look at your problems and go from there. Can we find the right fit? And I think there's just a big misalignment there. And I think that, like I say, we've almost kind of given ourselves a bit of bad rep now with the amount of people that probably get contacted on a daily basis around a new cybersecurity solution or a new tool or something which again is going to be game changing for them.
Yeah.
But actually, again, it's very much vendor driven as opposed to being customer driven.
Yeah. Okay. So then if you look at it from the other perspective, then um, from your perspective in sales, which you have already touched on, um, can you see a gap between what vendors are selling, what business actually need, and what does that gap actually look like? So
Yeah.
you've said there's a degree of frustration and things like that, and they're not seeing that. What does that gap look like?
I think the gap is essentially probably overcomplicating something which doesn't need overcomplicating. I think that's the
Right.
first answer.
Okay.
The second answer I would say is with that comes an element of simplification. But what we're seeing, or what I'm seeing anyway, is vendors who have incentivized multi-year contracts.
Okay.
So typically 3 years seems to be the rounded size
Yeah.
within cybersecurity. So a 3 year deal. What you'll tend to find is year one, there's a bit of, I suppose, learning. There's an element of alignment that happens, and naturally, it's always in maybe the first year of a contract can take a bit of time to get to speed.
Yeah.
Certainly, as the teams start to integrate and that partnership starts to build. But as you get into years 2 and 3, that's where you should really start to see the value. Now, when you when anyone sits down and looks at budgets, and when anyone sits down and looks at, okay, where does our
Yeah.
spend actually amalgamate over potentially multiple vendors?
Yeah.
Typically, you're going to be looking at, okay, well, what are we getting as a return on investment?
Hmm.
What tends to happen is, and I don't know whether, and this is maybe something we'll come on to, I don't know whether it's a complacency thing. I'm not sure whether it's a laziness thing. There's obviously this huge buzz around AI, and
Yeah.
um, I suppose I've got differing views on that, but we seem to be driven now into a very much a tool focused environment where there's a lot of tools, a
Mm.
lot of controls. In fact, most organizations now have got more controls than they know what to do with. I mean, there's more
Yeah.
controls in place than ever before, yet we're still seeing breaches. So there has to be a misalignment there.
Yeah.
But I do tend to find, to answer the question around what does that gap look like, I find that it's your vendor stack isn't probably aligned to your specific security goals as much as you think it is, and not just as your
Okay.
security goals, but probably more your actual organizational core objectives and strategy.
Yes. And that's a really good point actually, because the strategy piece is so important, isn't it? Really, because it's
Yeah,
like otherwise, you could kind of apply it to almost every walk of life, couldn't you? Really, it's like, well, let's take fitness as a slightly random left of center kind of analogy. If you don't know whether you're trying to run a marathon or get into
yeah,
shape, get fit, it's almost like a trainer salesperson coming to your front door and going, these trainers are going to change everything about your fitness approach.
exactly.
Trainers are 300 quid, but they're going to change everything. So you buy the
Yeah,
trainers, you're like, hang on a second, is this actually aligned to what I'm trying to do? And
yeah,
the cybersecurity industry is almost the same as that, isn't it? Because unless you're taking the piece a level above and looking
yeah.
at the strategy of what an organization is trying to do, you're just trying to crowbar in a a solution,
It's
which is
such a
not.
good point. And I
Yeah.
think it's a great analogy. It is a bit like having, it's a bit like having speed shoes for a 100 meter race, whereas actually you might
Mm,
need it for a marathon, or you might need it
yeah.
for, or it might be a bit like having a marathon trainer when you actually just need it for everyday walking use.
Yeah.
Completely different applications and completely different ways of utilizing a product.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has to be specific to that individual. Going back to
Hmm.
organizations, it has to be specific to that organization. What is the
Yeah.
objective? What do you actually want out of it? And what direction
Yeah.
of travel are you going in? And it has to align all together. And if it doesn't, again, you're just kind of going to get yourself in a bit of a sticky situation, which I think we're seeing more and more of.
I think we are. Yeah. And so on that topic then, so a lot of cybersecurity strategy. So if an organization is thinking about their strategy and they are not just looking at a single vendor solution, that strategy might be driven by a regulate. It might be driven by a specific requirement inside a regulation like ISO, or and within the ISO 27001, it might state that you need to do cyber awareness or penetration testing, but it also might be something more overarching, maybe like the
Mm.
NCSE cyber assessment framework. So what advice would you, so an IT lead might be listening to this and thinking about, okay, yeah, totally, everything we said so far is resonating with them, but what advice would you give them to help them to kind of cut through the noise?
Yeah,
Because I use the noise kind of, the word noise a little bit, disparagingly, but from their perspective it is noise.
yeah.
But how do you, give them some advice to cut through that and identify secure, because they've identified that they might need a security solution to fit something, but how do they find something that is fit for purpose, I guess,
Yeah.
is the question.
Yeah, and I think the challenge with the reason this becomes a problem is time. That's, time
Yeah,
is what we're all kind of fighting against.
of
What
course.
we have with cyber is an industry it just moves at a pace. I don't think you'll ever meet another industry which just moves so quickly.
No.
So what you have is this kind of what I'm about to say is encourage people to take their time when looking at decisions, when looking at vendors, make a decision based upon what you believe is correct for strategy and business objectives. Yet that is a completely different decision-making scenario if you've just had a breach, for example, you just had even just an incident. So
Absolutely.
what
Yeah.
happens is you get this kind of this time window gets narrower, and your decision-making pressure goes up. So you have vendors which are queuing up at the front door to say we do X,
Yeah.
and this window of time and this opportunity of time to get something in place is decreasing by the second. So what you get then is a pressure cooker of time mixed with a decision, and ultimately that decision, on reflection, is it the best thing for you? So to answer the question to how people can do this properly is go into any conversation when you're talking to a vendor and understand what it is that firstly you're looking to do. What does your
Yeah.
security journey look like? Because that's really, really important. They might be able to help you out with that as well, but that has to be ideally driven from your objectives and strategy.
Strategy.
Um,
Yeah.
and then how can you integrate that across the board? So for IT leaders and C-suite specifically, why does that business function in the first place? So make it around core organizational objectives to start with, and then go from there. Because again, we get drawn down this cybersecurity specific stuff, and that's probably partially due to frameworks. It's probably partially due to you go back to the noise, for example. It's partially due to that.
Yeah.
But cyber has to be an enabler and an integration within your existing business. It has to align within that, as opposed to being something separate. And we talk about it all the time around how security needs to be seen as a sort of a wider part of the organization as opposed to a separate department. And I think
Absolutely.
it's exactly the same when you're looking at any kind of control or any kind of cybersecurity purchase. It has to be in alignment to core organizational objectives. So when I go back to talking about that window of time, hopefully you can help yourself out there, because if you know what your objectives are by, I don't know, annual meetings or whatever they
Yeah.
might be, going with that, and how does security integrate into those?
Yeah, and I think everything has to be driven by a strategy ultimately, doesn't it? Because if it's not, then you're kind of almost just being forced down a particular whichever route, whichever vendor has the
Shouts the
biggest
loudest.
but shouts the loudest,
Yeah,
basically. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, exactly. So now we've talked about security solutions, so they are becoming more complex, aren't they? So like, if I think back, you're quite a bit younger than me, and I've been and I've been, if I think back, having things like the complexity got as far as, I think back about 15, maybe 20 years, an intrusion detection system and an IPS system would that was quite high on the complexity list, really, whereas something like that now is very commoditized. It's very basic. That's just anything that any basic perimeter firewall should be able to do, whereas the complexity of cybersecurity solutions has gone so much more advanced.
agreed.
So how does someone ensure they're making the right purchasing decision? So let's say, for example, all the other proverbial ducks are in a row.
Yeah,
We've got the strategy. We know they need to meet these compliancy requirements. They know they need to hit these keynotes of kind of the objectives. But how do they then know that whether they're making, because even if you know what it is you want, there's still hundreds and hundreds of vendors in that
yeah,
one specific tiny little vertical. How do they know they're making the right purchasing decisions rather than being driven by vendor pressure? Because if a vendor is piling that pressure on, and they might have that pressure coming from both ways, because you mentioned it before. There's a boiling point, isn't there? Or
there
the
is.
pressure cooker, or whatever term you use. And that might be coming from the board. The board might be saying to the CISO or IT directors, like, are we secure? Are you doing everything in your power to make sure we don't get breached? So the
Yeah,
pressure's coming from above,
yeah,
and the pressure's coming from the strategy, and it's also coming from the vendor pushing the sale. So how do
yeah.
they make sure they're not focusing too much on the specifics, and making the right decisions?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because I think that root cause of that question comes from the definition of what ROI looks like in cybersecurity. And this is an interesting topic of conversation, because I actually think ROI, or return on investment, looks different to a cybersecurity vendor than it does to a organization. So what I think we've got, I think the root cause of this is a board will look at, okay, well, we're going to spend X amount of money. And again, typically cyber solutions are expensive. If you look at a SOC, for example, it's probably one of the most expensive things as far as the operating cost goes. Again, dependent on scale of organization and organizational size, it's going to be up there in a bulky managed cost.
It is.
If you do it yourself, even more expensive. If you outsource it, it's still going to be an expensive
It's not
cost.
going to be cheap. Yeah.
But well, how do you quantify return on investment there? The board will say, well, okay, thank you for spending that, but what are we getting as a return as a byproduct? Now, with that topic area, you're kind of trying to quantify something which doesn't exist. So with a cyber vendor, what you're saying is ROI, and again, we have a part to play in this, because we are trying to, going back to the noise conversation, we're trying to cut through the noise. We're trying to stand out and say some kind of really quite optimistic statement of, and it's usually a percentage, so we promise we'll do this and you get X in return. In reality, it doesn't look like that for an organization. So they may be able to monitor some statistics, maybe response times. That's kind of a metric you could use. But within cybersecurity, often we're operating on intangibles. And we are, as professionals, I suppose, in that kind of, we are kind of ultimate pessimists, in all honesty. We look at what ifs, we look at operating costs as a what if. But in reality, it doesn't work like that. So again, to go back to the answer to the question, my best answer to that is to run real world simulations. So whenever you're looking at a SOC, for example, run a purple team, look at some sort of validation on it. Make sure, because I think as far as that goes, it's mutually beneficial for everyone. It will be mutually beneficial for the vendor, the SOC operator, and the SOC vendor. It'll be mutually beneficial to the customer, because they can look at, okay, well, is the vendor kind of going back to the gym? Are we keeping them fit? Are we making sure that we're operating the right way? Are we targeting the right things? Even if there's something that's found, that's not a reason not to do one. So yeah, that's a really, really good way of doing it. But I think, again, it does, the root kind of core to that question does come back from ROI. And I think the reason which we can't put a definition on that is because it's so difficult to quantify, and it looks different on both sides of the coin. It will look different to the vendor, and it will look different to the person actually that's going to be utilizing it.
Yeah, and I think when you look at things like that you mentioned the KPIs, if you look at things like let's say take a penetration testing report. So doing something once a year, that could be seen as something, actually we've done that, and these are all the issues we found, or these are the testing company found, and we've addressed them all now. So we can tick that proverbial box. But then you talked about sort of doing more purple teaming, and that's obviously, creating that blend between how do we defend and how do we demonstrate an attack, and how that kind of looks from a blended perspective. But then what does, how like the return on investment, the ROI we're talking about is even then, okay, so we've reduced the number of vulnerabilities we've found, we've done that, we've done all of these things, that's even those that link between that and an ROI isn't that clear either, is it?
You can't put a financial cost on it. You just really can't, because again, if you go on. I was just to say, if you think about the what ifs again, you might, so the typical equation, or the typical metric that we look at is a figure that you spend that you hopefully mitigate against another figure which you might potentially get in fines, you might get in reputational damage, lack of income because of reputation. But again, that's impossible to measure. That is absolutely impossible. That does, though, directly link back into a core objective for a business in the way it operates to survive, which is revenue. So there is, but again, completely intangible, virtually impossible to quantify. And I think, again, for anyone listening, if you can get through to a vendor that can run any kind of POCs, that's also a really good way of doing it. Try and get a POC for as long as possible, because you're then making a decision based upon at least something which you can tangibly and visibly see.
Yes.
If it's a tool, for example, run a POC. Typically, vendors will want to do it for some either reduced cost, sometimes free of charge. But at
Yeah.
least then you can see, okay, well, how does it integrate within our systems? What does it actually physically look like?
Yeah.
Um, that's usually a good starting point, rather than just kind of buying on a theory, I suppose, or buying on something that's an idea or a topic.
Yeah, and that's quite good. So going into POCs, it's really good to have like the really clear idea before you sort of start working with the vendor, because the
Yeah,
vendor will, if you let the vendor generate the POC, they'll say, if we tick all of these boxes, are you happy to buy at the end of it?
exactly,
And of course, if the vendors come up with it as a POC, it's going to tick because they know it does those things. So
exactly.
it's got to come from you and the organization and the strategy, hasn't it?
Definitely, and take your
Yeah.
time. So when vendors do that, and as we both work in the same profession, so we know why they do it. There'll be a
Yeah.
typical kind of they'll lead you down this path, which is an easy route to sign, but just take your time. So after that POC
Mm.
is finished, just take your time and catch up as a team. Well, what does this look like for us? How does it
Yeah.
align to our objectives? Our
Hmm.
strategy over the next year is going to look like X. And again,
Yeah.
that's where people get a little bit, because that roadmap changes year on year. So you want to look at as longer term as possible.
Yeah.
And that's where again we go back into sort of multi-year contracts. That's where it can get a little bit difficult, because
Yeah.
your security journey over year one might look different to year two. Now, is that
Hmm.
vendor going to be able to adapt in the same pace that you are as well?
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
is it just a kind of a something that's a stationary thing, and it's not as elastic as what you need?
Yeah, exactly. And having like working with a partner that might integrate the vendor solution for you and be able to adapt. And even almost like if you're engaging with the partner rather than with the vendor, the partner might say, look, in year two, you need to do X. So what we could do, we could replace the product with something else, or
Yeah,
adapt it or add additional components on. So yeah,
yeah, spot on.
that's really key. So have you got, so one of the things we talked about is kind of, from the business perspective. Have you got any examples of where business might have invested in the security product that looked good on paper,
Yeah,
should have ticked all of the boxes, but actually in real world, failed to meet those expectations?
yeah. So we come across this all the time, and we know, and I won't name names because it's
Of
not fair for
course.
me to do so. They paid their SOC vendor in the millions, and I believe it was about 2 point something million.
Right.
We ran a couple of simulations on their environment, and we found some really, really alarming things. Now, the problem that I find is some organizations buy based upon prerequisites. So some
Hmm.
organizations, and I understand why this is the case, your large
Yeah.
organizations will buy based upon maybe revenue, maybe based upon team size, geographical
Yeah.
location, headquarter,
Hmm.
whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But the larger the organization, typically the more metrics you have to meet to work with that organization.
Right. Yeah.
Um, it's not always going to be the case that that organization meets your organizational needs.
That's
So
right.
what we have found in the past, again, is companies that have worked with an organization for maybe 3 years plus on
Hmm.
some kind of proactive defense, maybe get a little bit complacent, maybe kind of
Hmm.
see that as like this reoccurring cost. Well, they'll just keep coming
Yeah.
back, and we've done a great
Mm.
job, and they don't continually improve. And I think it's so important when you're working with a vendor over a longer period of time, is you
Mm.
have to have that continual improvement, because that's what you're going to be doing with your security posture. It's only fair
Yeah.
that the vendor's held to account as well. So we've seen it a couple of times with SOC vendors, and we've been able to bypass some of their fairly basic perimeter controls.
Yeah.
But it's really alarming. I think in terms of, I suppose, why that happens, I think there's a couple of reasons. There's kind of that shiny object syndrome. There's kind of that
Yeah.
new tool on the marketplace.
Hmm.
I think overcomplications are a big problem. We've already mentioned that. I think a really key part of this is integration, and I think a vendor that can be agnostic with existing solutions is
Yeah.
really, really helpful. So
Yeah.
if you're speaking to someone and they're saying we're just going to align and essentially stack on top of what you've already got, that's a
Yeah.
real positive for an
Mm.
organization, because when
Mm.
you're looking at and this is again why maybe as salespeople we get kind of a bit of a bad rep, because we're probably typically just going to say in a biased way, rip out
Yeah.
what you've done before and bring this in. And I
Yeah.
think that just that total displacement can be quite alarming to a customer.
Yeah.
But also then you're kind of writing off that cost, which
Yes.
even if it was a bad purchase, you still want to be able to try and integrate it and
Get something
try and
out of
get
it.
something out of it
Yeah.
value wise. But I think, yeah, like I say, it's all kind of aligns to the same problem, but we do see it quite a lot. And I think where we see it trend wise as the most is probably a larger term customers on a sort of a longer term contract where
Yeah.
maybe they've just kind of not kept up with the same pace, maybe a little bit of
Yeah.
complacency. And I think that just comes from that kind of reoccurring, well, it's all right, they'll renew, they'll renew, they'll renew.
Yeah.
And as that business grows as well, or as that vendor grows, they maybe be, at the start of that contract, they might be that kind of shiny new, going back to new object syndrome, that shiny new object where it's like, new customer, brilliant. And then over time, as they grow, as they bring on more customers, that service kind of goes, it declines a little bit, and then
Yeah.
that leads to risks and
We've
problems.
all we've all experienced it, haven't we, in some shape or form? As a
Yeah,
as a buyer, you get the red carpet rolled out to you for the
yeah,
first few months, and then it kind of tails off when they're onto the other things.
exactly.
Okay,
Yeah,
so we've talked about this in quite a cynical way, I
yeah,
suppose, in one regard. So just to kind of sort of round up what we've spoken about, because I don't think we're going to solve this solution on this
yeah,
on this cast. So we've got a magic wand. What changes need to happen in the security industry to shift from a sales focused mindset to
yeah,
one that's genuinely security focused and that actually
yeah.
helps businesses? What needs to change if we
I th
if we had the magic wand?
Yeah, I think we've already alluded to this, but I think the biggest change that we need is to listen to customer challenges and use
Mm,
that as a topic of the first time you speak to a customer or a
mm,
prospect, what are their challenges?
yeah.
And sometimes I think as vendors, if we are being completely honest, if we
Mm,
can't solve their challenges, be honest, and I think they'll respect you if you just say
yeah.
we
Yeah.
can't do it. And I
Yeah.
think if you, even better, if you can refer them over to someone who you know you can,
Hmm.
that's a better relationship to have. And I think ultimately it comes back to sort of solving problems effectively.
Yeah.
That has to be that has to initially on that first conversation with the customer, that has to come from them,
Yeah.
but you have to listen. And I think you should be listening, or as vendors, we should be listening more than we're talking. If we're
Mm,
listening to them more,
yeah.
there's hopefully a bit of a more sort of aligned fit. I'd probably sort of summarize it in maybe three key areas. So I would say
Yes.
the first thing, which I think is just so important, is aligning. We've spoken about strategy a lot, but it's aligning security solutions with business risk. That's
Yes.
what's point number one.
Yeah.
Point number two is instead of just adding complexity, try and improve resilience.
Mm,
That's point number two. And then in terms of, I suppose, how you kind of round that up, look at how do we help teams operationalize security, and how do we do that effectively? So how do we look at security as an idea in an operations environment? Because again, it does look different theoretically when you're talking to a vendor as it
of
does to in
course.
real life
Yeah.
situational practice within your organization. So look at again how that, go back to strategy, how that aligns, how that integrates within your existing team, and essentially how that will improve your efficiency when it comes to security operations.
Yeah, and I think those 3 points you've just summarised there, I think provided there summarise it perfectly. So thanks for that, Josh. It's been a really interesting subject, and we could probably go on. I say this almost every episode, but we could almost go on for 2 or 3 more hours if we wanted to. But yeah, no, that's been really interesting for me. Great speaking to you, Josh. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me, Anish.
Cheers.